The implications of a no-fly zone for these nuclear-armed nations is disastrous for the world, for our future. Earlier today, we had a standout in Boston and have called for standouts throughout Massachusetts, wherever you are, in whatever way, to educate and to reject the no-fly zone and call for diplomacy. Please use our easy tool in the chat to contact your members of Congress and President Biden, Secretaries Blinken and Austin, and Vice President Harris. Tell them to reject the no-fly zone. Thank you. Take action. And over to you, Calla.
Thank you so much, Susan. You will find those links in the chat. And now you guys have to listen to just one more short statement before we get into our questions with Ben. So I'm Calla. I am going to be moderating the webinar tonight. I work with MAPA and I'm a member of our No New Cold War working group. We believe that there is a new Cold War, or perhaps a Cold War that never ended, being perpetuated by the United States and the military-industrial complex in the 21st century. Recently, we've been discussing how this Cold War is maintained through psychological warfare throughout the world, but especially in the US, to confuse the public as to its true interests and to solicit public support and acceptance of imperialism, militarism, and the fighting of wars. So the mission of our group is education. We seek to educate ourselves and others in order to discern Cold War propaganda, reject it, and maintain consciousness of the true interests of all humanity. Struggling against the Cold War is an integral aspect of developing a mass public movement for peace. So we reject the demonization and othering of Russia and China, and we encourage international collaboration on global issues. Just in recent weeks, we have seen the West increasing xenophobia towards Russia and attempts at starvation sanctions on the Russian people. So we wanted to just preface this webinar by explaining that logic and letting you all know that our questions will be focused on exposing what we feel the Cold War media machine is emitting in their coverage and the role of the US and NATO in creating the crisis in Ukraine, and not on what we see as unfairly demonizing Russia or enforcing these warmongering and Cold War narratives. So thank you for just listening to that short preface. And now I'm so excited to introduce Ben. Before I do that, I also want to let you know that you can ask questions in the chat and I will try to get to them. I'm sure Ben would be happy to answer them. We probably won't be able to get to all. All right, so Benjamin Norton is a journalist, writer, and filmmaker. His journalism focuses primarily on US foreign policy and geopolitics. He is based in Latin America and speaks English and Spanish. And currently, Ben is the editor of Multipolarista, which is an independent news outlet reporting on the transition to a multipolar world. Without further ado, let me hand it over to Ben. And yeah, let's jump just into our first question. So thanks again so much for being here. And we want to get right into it about Russia and Ukraine. So from widespread warmongering around Ukraine to the downplaying of US wars in the global South, we have really seen the stronghold that imperialism and the military-industrial complex have on the Western media. And it seems any voices that criticize these systems or simply point out the historical context and the role that NATO and the US have played in creating the crisis in Ukraine seem to be suppressed with claims that they are Russian bots or Putin supporters. And you just published an article today about how the CIA director admitted the US is waging an information war against Russia that President Vladimir Putin is losing. So if there is an information war, how do you think it is shaping Western media rhetoric, and who is winning that war?
Well, thanks for having me. That's a great question. And the statement that you all agreed on is also a very good statement. It's a privilege to be here. It's always good to talk to anti-war activists. And hopefully today we can have a good discussion and kind of think about some of these issues, because obviously as anti-war activists, anti-war journalists, I think these are these difficult moments where we have to have these discussions that can be, very nuanced, because obviously we don't support war anywhere, but we should recognize the role that the US government and NATO have played in creating this new war. And while we push for peace, we also should recognize that it's not a one-sided conflict, and the burden of peace is not only on Russia. The burden of peace is, in fact, largely on the United States and NATO that have been responsible for so many wars around the world. And, I just wanted to begin today saying that I think everyone, it's become basically this kind of like biblical duty that you have to condemn Russia and condemn Putin. So I think we should also begin today, and we should condemn the worst humanitarian catastrophe in the world today, the one that is never in the media, that's never mentioned. I'm talking about the war in Yemen, that according to the United Nations has led to over 370,000 deaths since Saudi Arabia launched this war in March 2015. This week, actually next week, this March is the 7th anniversary of this war that has been funded and supported by the US and Britain and also France, and waged by Saudi Arabia and the UAE, and has resulted in the worst humanitarian catastrophe on earth. Millions of people going hungry, millions of people displaced, and nearly 400,000 have lost their lives, according to the UN. So just so we have a little context here, that the tragedy in Ukraine certainly is something that we should be concerned about, but we also need to be proportionate. And the media is not in any way proportional in its coverage. So anyway, to directly respond to your question about information war, you're referring to an article I just published at multipolarista.com. And I watched this Senate Intelligence Committee hearing, just pulling my hair out, listening to all these warmongers just try to one up each other. Tom Cotton criticizing the CIA for not being warmongering enough. I mean, there were Democrats, of course, pushing for more war, but especially a lot of these neoconservative Republicans like Marco Rubio were condemning the administration for not sending enough weapons, even though the Biden administration has already sent thousands of missiles, thousands of anti-tank munitions, anti-aircraft missiles as well, that it's very similar to what happened in the 1980s in Afghanistan, in which the US sent these anti-aircraft missiles that were used by the Mujahideen, backed by the CIA. And after that war ended, after the Soviet Union left Afghanistan, you ended up with these extremist groups, including Al-Qaeda and the Taliban, that had these anti-aircraft munitions. And we also see a demand by many people in the Senate and the House that the US send warplanes, including MiGs, MiGs, to Ukraine. And then, of course, you mentioned the fear of the potential of the creation of a no-fly zone, which is a brilliant act of marketing, because a no-fly zone sounds great. Who would be against the idea of a peaceful no-fly zone? But in reality, what it is actually calling for is shooting down Russian planes, which means the potential for World War III. And specifically because Russia has put its nuclear weapons on high alert for the first time since the 1960s, it also means the very real possibility of nuclear conflict. So given all of that context there, going back to this idea of information war, in this hearing before the Senate Intelligence Committee, William Burns, the CIA director, said that the US is waging an information war. And of course, he didn't go into many details about that information war, but I think we should understand that the targets of information wars waged by the US, of the campaigns of manufacturing consent, as spelled out brilliantly in the magnum opus, this book by Edward Herman and Noam Chomsky, and that book is still extremely relevant 4 decades later. The main targets of this information warfare are not the right, it's actually the left. And I think this is something we should keep in mind today during our discussions here. I think most people here are probably progressives, leftists, socialists, and some variety. And the target of this propaganda is not the right wing, because the right wing is pro-war. I mean, pretty much every conservative, every right-winger already supports war. They don't need to manufacture consent for the right. But who they do need to manufacture consent for are progressives, are socialists, are social democrats. And we've seen this propaganda kick into hyperdrive with this campaign to convince people that NATO, this warmongering alliance that destroyed the country of Yugoslavia that no longer exists, that basically destroyed the country of Libya in 2011, bringing open-air slave markets to what had once been the most prosperous country in Africa. We're now supposed to believe that NATO is this peace-loving, great democratic institution. I mean, this propaganda campaign, this information war, as the CIA director admitted, has done the incredible. It has convinced people that NATO, which was created as an anti-communist alliance to wage war on the socialist bloc in the First Cold War, that NATO, which supported former Nazis, former Nazi collaborators, and former fascists as part of its infamous Operation Gladio, that NATO, which waged war on Yugoslavia and Libya and Afghanistan for 20 years, and just finally withdrew after 20 years of occupying Afghanistan, they have convinced people that this warmongering alliance is an alliance for peace. That's an incredible act of propaganda. And then finally, I mean, I mentioned the propaganda surrounding the idea of a no-fly zone. The targets of this information war are our friends, our colleagues, the people we work with who are part of the progressive movement, some of whom are anti-war activists and who justifiably are upset and opposed to the Russian invasion of Ukraine, but now they're being coerced into supporting the most violent warmongering alliance on earth, which is NATO. So I think that the point that I need to stress here at the beginning is that anyone who considers himself an anti-war activist needs to, in addition to demanding peace in Ukraine, and we can talk in a bit about the diplomatic possibilities for peace. There are negotiations going on in Belarus and Turkey to try to end this war in Ukraine. At the same time, that's not sufficient. That is important, but it's not sufficient. What we also need to do is demand not only an end to NATO expansion, an end to NATO. NATO is not a defensive alliance. NATO has always been an offensive alliance since it was founded in 1949. And let's not forget, some of the founding members of NATO include the fascist dictatorship of Portugal. This is not hyperbole. Portugal had a fascist dictatorship for decades. And in 1949, it was one of the founding members of NATO. NATO has never had anything to do with democracy. NATO has always been a right-wing anti-communist alliance that was created before the existence of the Warsaw Pact. Now, what's incredible is how the history of NATO has been rewritten to portray NATO as a response to the Soviet-led security pact, the Warsaw Pact. The Warsaw Pact did not exist until 6 years after the creation of NATO in 1955. And let's not forget, the Soviet Union did not create the Warsaw Pact until, one, the Soviet Union formally asked NATO to join. And of course, NATO said no, because NATO existed to wage war in the Soviet Union. And two, the Soviet Union did not form the Warsaw Pact until a week after capitalist West Germany joined NATO. And after the end of World War II, after the Soviet Union, not just the US and Britain, but the Soviet Union played a lead role in defeating Nazi Germany, 27 million Soviets, including, by the way, millions of Ukrainians who were part of the Soviet Red Army, defeated Nazi Germany. And after the end of World War II, there was an agreement that Germany was supposed to be neutral. It was divided. It was occupied. And NATO added West Germany to this military alliance, which is what pressured the Soviet Union to create its own security pact. So anyway, the point I'm saying here is that NATO, from the very day it was founded in 1949, has never been a defensive alliance. And while we have our discussion today, I think we need to understand that, yes, we should be calling for peace in Ukraine, but we also should be calling for an end to NATO. And as I'll talk about in a bit, I'm going to pivot back to you all for other questions, but I can talk about the role of NATO in creating this war in the first place.
Well, I think we will go just there. We got a great question in the chat, and I'm just going to combine it with one we have prepared. So one thing I've noticed is that a lot of Americans think this war just began with Russia's military operation starting February 24th, because as you've described, most Western media outlets haven't provided the accurate coverage and fail to mention the civil war that has been going on in the Donbas region since 2014, since the US-backed coup and the NATO-backed coup. So how long has this war actually been happening, and why does this context about the Donbas region matter? And just to add on this question in the chat, can you give an overview of Zelensky, Calla Walsh, and the rise of the servant of the People Party and the role of NGOs?
Yeah, great questions. So those are two very separate questions. I'll just start with the discussion of the civil war in Ukraine, because if you read any media reports in the past several months, you would think that this war just began in late 2021 or began when Russia invaded on February 24th. This war began in 2014. And before Russia sent a single troop into Ukraine on February 24th, more than 14,000 Ukrainians had died in an 8-year civil war fueled by the United States and NATO. And we need to be absolutely clear about this, that Russia, yes, it bears responsibility for escalating this war, but Russia did not start the war. In fact, in many ways, it was the United States that started the war in Ukraine by orchestrating a coup in 2014. Now, Ukraine had a democratically elected government in 2014, led by President Viktor Yanukovych. Yanukovych was corrupt. He was certainly not a leftist. He's not some great progressive model, but he was democratically elected, and he was politically neutral. Western media outlets frequently portrayed him as pro-Russia, which really means he wasn't anti-Russia. And what he tried to do is he tried to balance Ukraine between the Western powers and Russia. Sometimes he went with Russia, sometimes he went with Western powers. And yes, he was corrupt. I mean, every president of Ukraine is corrupt. This is probably one of the most corrupt countries on earth. It's been by Western NGOs funded by Western governments, it's been referred to as the most corrupt country in Europe. And I mean, it indisputably is. So in 2013, Yanukovych, the elected Ukrainian president, was in discussions for an EU association agreement, which basically would have been a step toward integrating Ukraine with the European Union. And specifically, it was a step toward economic integration of doing more trade with the EU. Now, many of us probably know that the EU is, first of all, not a very democratic institution. Most of its leadership is not elected. And the EU is also a thoroughly neoliberal institution. We can see what the EU has done to Greece, devastating this country with horrible austerity measures that have resulted in the standard of living declining, poverty increasing, unemployment increasing in Greece, that has been suffering under this odious debt. And the European Union is basically controlled by Germany and the German central bank and German bankers, and to a lesser extent, French bankers. And we have seen that the European Union has forced these right-wing neoliberal structural adjustment programs on countries, especially Spain, Italy, Greece, countries in the south that have debt. And when Ukraine was trying to come to this agreement in 2013, the EU imposed these strenuous demands that basically required neoliberal structural adjustment, privatization of state assets, cutting social programs. And Yanukovych, again, who's not some great leftist, he just said, this is unacceptable. These terms are not acceptable for us. And Russia, recognizing that there was an opportunity, instead offered a more favorable economic agreement to Ukraine, and Yanukovych accepted that agreement with Russia. And this is when the Western government-funded Color Revolution Network went into effect in 2014. They started launching these protests, calling Yanukovych a pro-Russian despot who's corrupt and all these things, all the typical propaganda. And then there was a violent coup in February of 2014. And during this coup, there were numerous US government officials who were physically in Kiev, the capital of Ukraine, including John McCain, the hardcore right-wing neoconservative former senator who never saw a war he didn't love, including Chris Murphy, who's actually a liberal Democrat, and also the most important name in terms of the people in Ukraine at the time, Victoria Nuland. Victoria Nuland is the third in command of the US State Department right now. She was also a significant figure in the State Department in the Obama administration. Victoria Nuland is a hardline neoconservative, war hawk. She is married to Robert Kagan, one of the co-founders of the Project for the New American Century. She also, Victoria Nuland, was a foreign policy advisor for Dick Cheney, of course, one of probably the main architect of the Iraq War, the power behind the throne of the Bush Jr. administration, vice president under George W. Bush. So Victoria Nuland is a hardcore warmonger, and especially has a vicious hatred of Russia. And she was involved in orchestrating this coup in Ukraine. And this is not my opinion. This is very well substantiated by evidence. For instance, there was a leaked recording that being realistic was probably recorded by Russian intelligence, but it has been verified between her and Jeffrey Platt, who was the US ambassador in Russia, the U.S. ambassador in Ukraine at the time. And in this phone call that was leaked between the U.S. ambassador in Ukraine and this important State Department official, Victoria Nuland, they can be heard in this recording handpicking who the leaders of the Ukrainian government will be after the coup in February 2014. And specifically, Victoria Nuland says, Yats is the guy. Yats is the guy. Yats is a short version of a right-wing neoliberal politician in Ukraine who was later installed as one of the top officials in the government under the billionaire oligarch Petro Poroshenko. So, we have this leaked phone call, which is a smoking gun, showing U.S. government officials discussing who the leaders of the post-coup, post-Maidan Ukrainian government would be. I say Maidan because this coup operation was referred to as Maidan or Euromaidan, named after the plaza in central Kiev, in the capital, where the protests began that later became violent. And by the way, far-right neo-fascist and neo-Nazi groups were the main muscle behind this coup. They also viciously attacked leftists in Ukraine, including they massacred leftists at a union hall, at the meeting hall, the building of a labor union in Odessa, burning over 40 people alive, killing them, most of them leftists. So anyway, we can't understand what's going on in Ukraine without understanding that historical context. After the 2014 coup, that's what led to a civil war. There were Russian-speaking Ukrainians in the eastern part of the country who rose up against the coup regime in Kiev. They refused to recognize the legitimacy, and they demanded independence. And now they have been referred to often as pro-Russian separatists, which, I mean, okay, I guess, but they are Ukrainians who speak Russian because nearly 20% of the Ukrainian population are ethnically Russian. They're politically, in terms of their nationality, Ukrainian, but they speak the Russian language, and their rights have consistently been repressed, especially after the 2014 coup, in which there were attempts to prevent them from speaking Russian in schools, prevent the use of Russian language in the media, and repression also physically after they rose up against the government. And this led to this massive civil war in Ukraine. And share my screen here and look at UN statistics, which are never mentioned in mainstream corporate media. If you all can see my screen here, these are statistics from the UN Human Rights Office. This is not some anti-imperialist leftist website. This is not RT. This is as mainstream as it gets, the UN Human Rights Office. And these are statistics of civilian casualties that happened after the start of the civil war in 2014, that again was started by the US-backed coup in 2014. These look at civilian casualties. These are the most recent statistics we have published this January. These are civilian casualties between 2018 and 2021. So that's 4 years of this conflict, which has been an 8-year civil war ongoing. And according to the UN, in these 4 years, most recent years of civil war in Ukraine, which are just totally erased. This is all before Russia invaded. 81.4% of the civilian casualties were in the self-proclaimed independent republics of Donetsk and Lugansk in the eastern Donbass region of Ukraine. These are the two breakaway republics in which people speak Russian. They're ethnically Russian. They're often called pro-Russian separatists. So this is the UN acknowledging that more than 4/5 of civilian casualties in the civil war in the past 4 years were caused by the Ukrainian government, the Ukrainian military, and the paramilitary groups that it backs. This is a very important detail that we cannot ignore. We can't understand this conflict in Ukraine without understanding this historical context. This is what led Russia 2 days before invading on February 24th to declare that it recognized the independence of the Donetsk and Lugansk People's Republics. Now, this isn't to justify the Russian invasion of Ukraine, but we also should recognize that the Ukrainian government, which is, by the way, I mean, it's not just Russian propaganda. There are neo-Nazi forces that have significant influence in Ukrainian state security services, especially the military, the National Guard, and the police. They have played a key role in viciously repressing the population in eastern Ukraine, in these Russian-speaking regions. So that's not just Russian propaganda. Obviously, Russia has a vested interest in amplifying that and amplifying the grievances of people in the Donbass region, of exaggerating the role of Nazis in Ukraine. But that doesn't mean they don't exist. They very much do exist. And by the way, there's one other detail I want to provide here before answering the other question about Zelensky. And I can talk about the Nazi problem as well when I talk about Zelensky. And this is another historical episode that is even less known. Now, some people might know about this 2014 coup. The infamous Victoria Nuland phone call did get some media coverage because she made this flippant comment where she said, F the EU. No one cares about the EU, F the EU, which, by the way, is a reminder of what the US really thinks about its so-called European allies. F the EU is what they really think in private. But there's another historical episode that is extremely important to understand what got us here. And that is another US-backed coup. This was not a violent coup. This was a soft coup, a color revolution, if you will, exactly 1 decade before the 2014 violent coup in Ukraine. And very briefly here, I just want to get up this article that was published in The Guardian in 2004, back before The Guardian purged anyone with an anti-war bone in their body. And this is an article in November 2004 titled U.S. Campaign Behind the Turmoil in Kiev. This article talks about how the U.S. government backed another color revolution against the same leader, Viktor Yanukovych. Now, there was a runoff election in late 2014, and Viktor Yanukovych, the so-called pro-Russian candidate, who in reality was politically neutral, but not pro-Western, so he's called pro-Russian, Yanukovych won the runoff of the election. And because he was seen as being pro-Russian, Western governments refused to recognize the results of that election. And they activated the networks that they funded in Kiev, their fifth columns, these regime change networks. And they basically had a color revolution and had a kind of soft coup and demanded a new third round of the vote that they lost. And they had a massive propaganda campaign. And then their candidate, Viktor Yushchenko, who was the pro-Western candidate backed by the US, he won that election after a massive huge act of meddling, which makes the Russian Facebook memes supposedly behind Russiagate look like, child's play. So if you don't believe what I'm saying here, if you think this is exaggeration, very briefly, I'm going to read a few lines from this article in The Guardian, the voice of the British intelligence establishment, the voice of Blairism. This is their article in 2004. I mean, it's shockingly honest. And this did not end after 2004. This is exactly the kind of thing that Washington has continued in Ukraine ever since, and other countries in Eastern Europe and Asia and Latin America and Africa ever since. Here are a few lines here. They say that, oh, by the way, so this uprising that led to Viktor Yanukovych being pushed out and the pro-Western candidate Viktor Yushchenko winning the election, this was referred to as the Orange Revolution. It's a textbook example of a so-called color revolution backed by the US government. Here are some quotes from The Guardian. While the gains of the orange-bedecked chestnut revolution are Ukraine's, the campaign is an American creation, a sophisticated and brilliantly conceived exercise in Western branding and mass marketing that in 4 countries in 4 years has been used to try to salvage rigged elections and top unsavory regimes. Of course, that's their editorializing. Funding and organized by the US government, deploying US consultancies, pollsters, diplomats, the two big American parties, and US non-governmental organizations. The campaign was first used in Europe in Belgrade in 2000 to beat Slobodan Milosevic at the ballot box. They talked about the role of the US ambassador playing this role in the color revolution in Serbia, which was the classical example. And then they also tried it in Georgia with Mikhail Saakashvili, who also in 2008 launched an attack on Russia, and the US gave him the green light to do that. The New York Times later admitted that. And that led to Russia also doing a counterattack and attacking Georgia. And then Russia was blamed, even though the Georgian government later admitted that it started that war in 2008. And then fast forwarding a little bit here, they also tried to repeat, they brought in a veteran of the Contra War in Nicaragua, the fascist Contra Death Squads. They brought him to try to do a nearly identical campaign to overthrow the Belarusian president, Alexander Lukashenko. That was repeated 2 years ago in Belarus again. It failed. And then finally, they say after they tried it in Serbia successfully, Georgia successfully, and Belarus unsuccessfully, they repeated it again against the longtime president, Leonid Kuchma, in Kiev, in Ukraine. And they say that this operation is engineering democracy, they say. Engineering democracy through the ballot box and civil disobedience is now so slick that the methods have matured into a template for winning other people's elections. Like I said, an incredibly honest article here. And if I go down here, they named some of the main people involved in this US government-funded operation. The Democratic Party's National Democratic Institute, the Republican Party's International Republican Institute, the US State Department, and USAID, along with Freedom House, which is funded by the US government, and then the notorious anti-communist billionaire George Soros, whose name you're not allowed to mention in polite society, his Open Society Institute, which has long been partnered with the CIA on these regime change operations. So this is not just Russian propaganda. This is often called, the idea of a color revolution is called Russian propaganda. This is The Guardian. This is the voice of the British political establishment. And the last thing I'll read here is it says, in Ukraine, they spent an estimated $14 million to launch this so-called Orange Revolution. So the reason I went through that article and spent a few minutes going through that is because we can't understand what's happening in Ukraine, even just going back to 2014. We have to go back before that. I mean, not to mention the history of the Soviet Union, all that. We don't have time to get into that history. But the point is that the US has a very long history of meddling in Ukraine, overthrowing elected presidents, destabilizing governments that it doesn't like, and installing corrupt neoliberal puppets. And by the way, what have the results been for the people of Ukraine? They're now living in the poorest country in Europe. Around 1/2 of Ukrainians live in poverty, and poverty has skyrocketed since the 2014 US-backed coup, because, surprise, not only did the US unleash a civil war, but it also installed a right-wing billionaire oligarch, Petro Poroshenko, who is known as Willy Wonka, or the Chocolate King, because he got all his money in desserts and chocolate. And he's a billionaire neoliberal who privatized state assets, cut social programs, cut wages, cut pensions. I mean, this is the Washington consensus. These are the neoliberal policies that the US imposes around the world. And in Ukraine, it has resulted in Ukraine becoming the poorest country in Europe. And since the overthrow of the Soviet Union in 1991, Ukraine has never reached the same GDP level that it had when it was part of the Soviet Union. Let me repeat that. In 1991, before the overthrow of the Soviet Union, the economy of Ukraine was larger than the economy now. The GDP is smaller than it was in 1991. It has shrunk since 1991. So this is the historical context we need to keep in mind. Now, getting to Zelensky. Zelensky is a complex figure. When Zelensky was elected, he won a landslide election against the right-wing billionaire oligarch Petro Poroshenko, and he was running as the peace candidate. This is very important to understand to get us to where we are today. Zelensky spoke Russian on his campaign. Zelensky is of Jewish descent. Zelensky was trying to portray himself as a peace candidate who can help unite the Russian-speaking population in the East with the ultra-nationalists in the West, largely in the West, especially in the parts of Ukraine that had been part of Poland, in areas around the West where during the Nazi occupation of Ukraine during World War II, there were many Nazi collaborators in Ukraine, including Stepan Bandera, who's become basically a patron saint. He's been officially honored by the Ukrainian government ever since the 2014 US-backed coup. Again, this is a Nazi collaborator who created a fascist organization called the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists that was responsible for pogroms against Jews, massacres of tens of thousands, potentially hundreds of thousands of Jews, Poles, of communists, of the Romani population. So the point is that Zelensky ran as a peace candidate. He spoke Russian. He said that he wanted the war in the East to end, whereas Poroshenko had taken a hard, aggressive line with U.S. support, with billions of dollars of U.S. support, military aid, and advisors from the CIA and other U.S. agencies. He waged a war, a brutal civil war on the Donbass region, on the Donetsk and Lugansk People's Republics, and was responsible again for over 4/5 of civilian casualties in that civil war. And Zelensky said, we want this war to end and we want peace. And on that platform, he got 73% of the vote to just 24% for the right-wing nationalist oligarch billionaire Petro Poroshenko. Now, what happened, though? Zelensky entered office, and there were two things that happened. One, the U.S. just forced him to renege on all of his promises. He did a complete 180. And two, Zelensky had no political experience and had no idea what he was doing. So this gets to the other part of your question you asked about, the Servant of the People Party. What is this party? It's nothing. It's not a political party. It was a platform to get Zelensky elected. Who is Zelensky? He's literally an actor. Now, he has a background in law, but he's an actor. He was an actor who played a Ukrainian president on TV. He literally had a TV show in which he played the president of Ukraine. And you can watch a show on Netflix. It's called The Servant of the People. And after that show, which was funded by a billionaire oligarch who later funded his campaign, he ran for president and he turned the name of his show into the name of his party, Servant of the People, and he won as a TV star. Now, I mean, I guess we can't be too surprised because Donald Trump was also a reality TV. I mean, he was reality TV, which is just as fictional as Zelensky's show. But I mean, we're in a very surreal era of TV stars becoming presidents. And Zelensky had no political experience. So when he entered office, he immediately was just pushed into supporting Washington's line. And then there's another element. I should say there's a third element as well. And that's the role of the Nazis, the far-right extremists in Ukraine. And again, this is not just Russian propaganda. They have a very significant influence, especially in the state security apparatus. Now, you often see propaganda claim that, well, the Nazis and the far-right extremists in Ukraine do not actually have much influence because at the ballot box, these far-right parties like Svoboda, the right sector, the formerly called the Social Nationalist Party, National Socialists, they just reversed the language there. The Social Nationalist Party of Ukraine, these neo-Nazis in Svoboda, it's true that they only get a few percentage of the vote in the elections. That's true. However, the Nazis are not that influential in the political class. They're influential in the security apparatus. This brings us back to 2014. When the US orchestrated this coup in 2014, what happened is the government was weak, the Ukrainian military was very weak, and the billionaire oligarchs in Ukraine hired a bunch of gangs of thugs to attack the Russian-speaking separatists in the eastern part of Ukraine, who are Ukrainians. They're not Russians. They speak Russian, but they're Ukrainians. This is a civil war. So what happened is there were gangs like the Azov Battalion, the Aidar Battalion, and these other groups, Tornado Group, and all these Nazi gangs who were ideologically motivated to fight, unlike the Ukrainian military and National Guard, which had very low morale. So billionaire oligarchs gave them a bunch of money to these gangs to give them weapons and equipment to fight the Russian-speaking separatists in the east, and especially in the city, the coastal city in the southeast near the Azov Sea called Mariupol. There's been a lot of fighting since Russia invaded on February 24th. There's been a lot of fighting to seize Mariupol to try to make it part of the Donetsk People's Republic. Now, Mariupol was the base for this notorious fascist militia called Azov. Azov is a neo-Nazi militia. It was called the Azov Battalion because originally it started as this gang that was fighting these pro-Russian separatists in the east. And then what happened is after the coup, the government was so weak that Azov was incorporated into the National Guard, and it worked with the Ukrainian armed forces to fight these Russian-speaking separatists in Mariupol and successfully defeated them. The reason Mariupol fell back into the hands of the Ukrainian government is because these neo-Nazis played the defining role in this battle for Mariupol in 2014. And I want to explain something really quickly. This is an article I published at multipolarista.com, my website. These are the symbols used by Azov. Azov has been supported by the US government directly. The military advisors have been photographed from the US and Canada meeting with these Azov Nazis. These are the symbols. This is the official patch used by Azov. In the middle, you can see that this is another German Nazi symbol called the Wolfsangel. It was directly used by Nazi Germany. And on the right, you can see another neo-Nazi symbol used by white supremacists called the Black Sun. You'll sometimes see neo-Nazis, they'll have this tattooed on their elbows or their knees. And on the left, you can see that both of those Nazi symbols are incorporated together in Azov's official patch. And the water represents the Azov Sea. So it's called Azov because that's where the sea is. And they were based in Mariupol. So this is a literal Nazi group. Here are photos. And by the way, these are tweets that I posted from an article back in 2018. I've been reporting on Ukraine and the neo-Nazis. This is January 2018 for over 4 years now, for more than 4 years. I mean, but these are tweets from 2018. This is a problem that has been known about for a long time. This is not Russian propaganda. Obviously, it's in Moscow's interest to exaggerate it, but it's a very real problem. And these forces are not elected. It doesn't matter if Zelensky's Jewish. He doesn't elect who the military is. He doesn't elect who the police are. Joe Biden doesn't pick who police officers are. He doesn't pick much of the military. I mean, some people, but most of the military command is made internally within the Pentagon. He doesn't choose most of the people in the National Guard. These are the people who are the most ideologically motivated to fight the Russian-speaking separatists. Now, why is that? Because they preach a Nazi ideology, a white supremacist ideology that portrays Russians as Asiatic, as descendants of the Mongols. And they say that, and the Golden Horde. And they say that Ukrainians are a pure white race, whereas Russians are Asiatic. And actually, we've seen this propaganda talking point reflected in Western media that have published like these crazy stories portraying Putin as like a Mongol warrior, and like also all this insane propaganda. Like the media has gone white nationalist recently and talking about how it's bad. This war in Ukraine is worse than the war on Yemen or Syria or Libya or Iraq or Afghanistan because they have blonde hair and blue eyes and they're civilized, as these Western journalists are saying. So, I mean, these are photos of US and Canadian military officers meeting with Azov, and you can see their Nazi Wolfsangel patches. And this is an article I published it's called Ukraine's National Guard boasts of Nazis killing Russian Muslim orcs with lard bullets. This is a tweet that was posted by the official Ukrainian National Guard account with the blue check mark on Twitter on February 27th, 3 days after Russia invaded. They wrote boasting of Azov fighters of the National Guard greasing the bullets with lard against the Kadyrov orcs. That is the name of the leader of Chechnya. Chechnya is part of the Russian Federation and is part of Russia. And there are Chechen fighters from the Russian military who are in Ukraine. And the vast majority of Chechens are Muslim. So they're referring to Chechen Muslims as orcs. And this is the Ukrainian National Guard posting a video of Ukrainian Nazis taking their bullets and putting them in pig fat and then putting them in their gun because they think that this will send the Chechen Muslims to hell because it's haram to eat. I mean, by the way, being touched by pigs doesn't mean like you're violating Islam. They don't eat pork, but I mean, whatever. You don't expect Nazis to understand basic facts. Like, again, this is not just Russian propaganda. This is the Ukrainian National Guard's official Twitter account boasting of its Nazi fighters putting pig fat on its bullets. Again, this isn't to justify Russia's invasion. But we need to be very clear here that just because Zelensky is Jewish doesn't mean that Ukraine doesn't have a serious Nazi problem. It does have a very serious Nazi problem. One final thing I'll say before going back to another question here. And the Atlantic Council published an incredible report admitting this. Now, what is the Atlantic Council? The Atlantic Council is NATO's de facto think tank in Washington. It is one of the most influential groups in the Beltway. It has very significant influence in US foreign policy circles and has pushed for a very aggressive line against Russia in particular. The Atlantic Council is funded by the US government, the British government, other European governments. It is funded by the weapons industry, the military industrial complex that has a vested interest in sending more weapons to Ukraine. And it's also funded by the fossil fuel industry, which I can talk about later, because this is another important part of this is because the US is also competing with Russia over the European energy market. The US is trying to prevent Russia from sending oil and gas exports to the EU, and the US wants to send its oil and gas to the EU. And the US has recently become the largest exporter of liquefied natural gas, LNG, for the first time in history because of this conflict in Ukraine. But this is an article at the Atlantic Council. Again, NATO's de facto voice in Washington. And they have this hilarious article from 2018 titled, "Ukraine's Got a Real Problem with Far-Right Violence." And no, RT didn't write this headline. So again, this is not Russian propaganda. This article admits that a neo-Nazi group called C14, which has that name because the 14 is a reference to the white supremacist 14 words slogan, which is something like, we want to secure a future for our white children or whatever, that they received a grant directly from the Ukrainian Ministry of Youth and Sports to promote so-called national patriotic education projects. This is a neo-Nazi group that has attacked the Roma community. It's attacked anti-fascist demonstrators. It's attacked LGBT events. Again, a neo-Nazi group with a white supremacist name received direct funding from the Ukrainian government. So again, this is not Russian propaganda. Ukraine has a very serious Nazi problem. And yes, it has a Jewish president, but the reality is that he doesn't have that much influence, like Joe Biden doesn't have that much influence, like any US president. The military industrial complex controls the US government, the CIA, the large arms corporations, the Pentagon, the other Beltway contractors, Wall Street, Silicon Valley. The US president has very minimal control over foreign policy, which is why it's consistent among every single president. And Zelensky has very little control, and he doesn't control the unelected state security services.
Thank you so much for that very, very thorough answer. And we really appreciate you sharing the resources too. So I want to touch on Nazism since we were planning on asking you about that. And we had someone in the chat asking, why are we talking about this? Like focusing on that right now is distracting from the Ukrainian civilians being impacted. But I feel like it is important for us to be talking about this right now because, in most Western outlets, if you go on CNN or BBC, you're more likely to see a comparison of Putin to Hitler than you are to see any mention of the Nazi battalions that are in the Ukrainian military right now. So could you speak to the role that those fascist forces are playing right now in Ukraine? I've heard allegations of war crimes. I've heard that they could be likely to sabotage a peace deal with Russia. So could you speak to that at all?
Absolutely. I'm going to share a few things really quickly. Again, actually, before that, I'll say very briefly, why are we talking about this? Because one, as you just acknowledged in your question, these neo-Nazis and far-right extremists are playing a key role in the fight in Ukraine. Two, they played a key role in killing, or not them personally, but in fueling the 14,000 deaths of Ukrainians in the past 8 years before Russia invaded, which is what led to this war. Like I said, Russia has responsibility for escalating this conflict, but Russia did not start this war in Ukraine. It started with the US-backed coup in 2014 and the civil war in which these neo-Nazi groups that were directly incorporated into the Ukrainian National Guard, they played a key role. And then another key point of this is that we have to understand that, again, it doesn't justify the Russian invasion, but Russia does have real security problems. The Russian invasion of Ukraine, although it is something that we shouldn't support, is not like the US invasion of Iraq or Afghanistan. Those are countries on the other side of the planet. And no one in their right mind would believe that Iraq is a so-called threat to US national security. Whereas for Russia, Ukraine, a country on its border with a 1,400-mile long border with these far-right extremist groups that have been waging a civil war for 8 years, that is a very serious concern for Russia. Not to mention Ukraine potentially joining NATO, the de facto NATOization of Ukraine that's gone on since the 2014 coup, with NATO military exercises happening as recently as October of last year. And in Estonia, a country directly bordering Russia, another NATO member, NATO military exercises happening this February with British and French soldiers 100 kilometers from Russia's border. So anyway, the point is that this isn't to justify the Russian invasion, but we have to understand Russia's perspective to understand this conflict, because it's not just a one-sided conflict. Like I said, it's way too simple to just say, oh, Russia, Putin, blah, 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 all the media propaganda. No, the US and NATO bear direct responsibility for starting this war that Russia did escalate but did not start. So really quickly here, this is an example of what these Nazis have been doing in this war. Again, this isn't to justify the Russian invasion, but again, Ukraine is not some great, cuddly, peace-loving democracy. These Ukrainian Nazis have been literally burning books. If you don't believe me, here is from Richard Engel. He is the NBC chief foreign correspondent. He tweeted about this checkpoint in the capital, Kiev, stuffed with Soviet-era books, many about communism and political theory in the USSR. A local commander said they'll be using them to light tires on fire as Russians advance. We don't need them. These are the people that the West is supporting in Ukraine. Why do I say this? Did people not learn from what happened in Afghanistan in the 1980s? In the 1980s, the Soviet Union militarily intervened in Afghanistan, and the US, the CIA, Pakistani intelligence, ISI, and Saudi Arabia spent a decade arming and training and funding far-right death squads, similar to the Contra death squads in Nicaragua, where I am right now. And what happened to those groups? They were called the Mujahideen. They became Al-Qaeda. They became the Taliban. The Taliban and Al-Qaeda have direct origins in a CIA, Pakistani, Saudi operation supporting the Mujahideen in Afghanistan against the Soviet Union in the 1980s. The US National Security Advisor for Jimmy Carter, he said openly that that was the intentional strategy. Brzezinski was his name. He said that it was the Afghan trap. And that led to the creation of Al-Qaeda and the Taliban. We now see NATO and Western governments flooding Ukraine with weapons. What do we think is going to happen to these neo-Nazi extremists? Even if the war ends, do we think that they're just going to put their guns down? That's the reason I talk about this is the US and NATO are repeating exactly what they did in Afghanistan in the 1980s. Don't just take it from me. Hillary Clinton just did an interview on TV in which she said that we were repeating the strategy we used in Afghanistan in Ukraine. She said it. So we really need to be concerned about this while we push for peace. We can talk about that in a bit. The only solution to the conflict in Ukraine is a peaceful settlement. And there are negotiations going on. Now, the US, the EU, and NATO are not supporting those peace negotiations. They're pushing for escalation. They're sending thousands of new anti-tank and anti-aircraft missiles. They're talking about sending aircrafts. They're talking about sending potentially other weapons. They're sending billions of dollars of military aid. They're encouraging people from around the world to go to Ukraine to fight against Russia, just as they did in Afghanistan in the 1980s. And who are the people who are going? Many of them are far-right extremists. A friend of mine, Brian Meir, a very good journalist, he just published an article. I'll get it out briefly just to show the headline. He published a really good article. He lives in Brazil, and he published an article about the Brazilian neo-Nazis who have been flocking to Ukraine and how for years, ever since the 2014 coup, Ukraine became like a symbol for the Brazilian far right and the far right president Jair Bolsonaro, they have been calling to Ukrainize Brazil. This is not new. Again, why am I talking about this? Because if you want to understand what's going on this week in Ukraine, you can turn on the news. But I'm talking about the facts that the Western corporate media refuses to talk about, because they act as though this conflict in Ukraine began on February 24th. It did not begin on February 24th. This campaign that Russia waged, this invasion that Russia waged, escalated a conflict that has gone on for many years now, that the US and NATO have started, that they bear responsibility for. And as peace activists in the United States, it is fundamentally the responsibility of peace activists in the US to oppose that NATO expansion and to push for peace and negotiations, which we've seen going on right now. And the US needs to be pressured to support those peace negotiations. What are Russia's demands in those peace negotiations? One, Ukraine has to be neutral. It can't become part of NATO. Two, Ukraine has to demilitarize. Three, that Crimea needs to be recognized as being part of the Russian Federation, and that the Donetsk and Lugansk People's Republics need to be recognized as independent. Now, the first two parts should be uncontroversial. Ukraine should not be a Western military colony with US nuclear weapons right on Russia's border pointed at Russia. Pushing for that is bad for the people of Ukraine. It's bad for the people of Russia. It's bad for everyone. It could lead to nuclear war. I should mention that Donald Trump bears responsibility. The so-called Russian puppet, Donald Trump, bears major responsibility for tearing up the INF Treaty. The INF Treaty prevented putting nuclear weapons and intermediate range ballistic missiles in parts of Europe. They can now be put there. That means that even if Ukraine is not even part of NATO, the US could put nuclear weapons in Ukraine that have a 3 to 8 minute launch time to Russia. I mean, what country would tolerate that? Do you think that the US would tolerate the Russia organizing a coup in Mexico, overthrowing the elected Mexican government, installing a pro-Russian regime, and then creating a civil war in northern Mexico on the US border, in which far-right extremists and neo-Nazis play a key role as the muscle behind that force, in which tens of thousands of Mexicans are killed, in which a refugee crisis is created, and then Russia puts nuclear missiles in Mexico that have a 3 to 8 minute flight time to Washington? Do you think that the US would tolerate that for 1 microsecond? For 1 nanosecond? No. That's why I talk about this historical context, because yes, that doesn't mean that we support the Russian invasion, but as peace activists, we also recognize that the main culprits for this war are the US and NATO. So as peace activists, our fundamental goal is calling for an end to this war, calling for a peace settlement, and calling for an end to NATO, not just an end to NATO expansion, an end to NATO, which has created so many wars.
Thank you. I want to bring up the burning question that seems to be asked when we bring up this historical context, or when we talk about things like Nazism in Ukraine, which is, why are you defending Russia? Why are you supporting their invasion? And I wanted to see if you could speak to that and sort of what your response is when you receive that response to your reporting. And also, like, why is it so important for us to be taking this stance right now? Because it would be so easy to go along with what every single mainstream outlet and mainstream politician and mainstream voice is saying right now. So why take so much heat, and why is it so important for us to be exposing the US role in this crisis?
My response is, George W. Bush, you're with us or you're with the terrorists. This is the same logic of post 9/11 America. And we're seeing the same hysteria, the same talking points. If you try to have a nuanced perspective that understands Russia's perspective without endorsing Russia's invasion, then you're being called an apologist for Russia. Just as if you try to have a nuanced understanding of why the US was attacked on 9/11 without obviously not defending Al-Qaeda, not defending Osama bin Laden, you're called a supporter of terrorists. Now, we shouldn't compare Russia to Al-Qaeda. It's a ridiculous comparison. I mean, the Russian military is not Al-Qaeda. That's an absurd comparison. So I'm not comparing the invasion to 9/11. 9/11 was worse in many ways, although the Russian invasion of Ukraine is bad. I'm not saying it's good, but the point is, I'm saying that this is the same logic, that if you say, well, the US is not innocent, the US bears direct responsibility for creating all of these conflicts with its warmongering foreign policy around the world. If you say that, then you say, well, you're with the terrorists. That's what George Bush said. It's the same exact logic. And what's incredible is seeing some people who were against that logic during the Bush administration are now supporting that same logic against Russia, because so many people lost their minds over Russiagate, over the idea that Trump was this Putin puppet, Russian puppet, even though Trump, by the way, sent weapons to Ukraine that even Obama refused to send. Trump tore up 2 different treaties with Russia that led to the potential for nuclear escalation and the potential for putting nuclear weapons on Russia's doorstep. So why do I talk about all these details? Because one, I think pretty much everyone on this call is an American, and what can they do? They can pressure the US government. I mean, unless you're Russian, I don't think you're going to have much influence inside Russia. And by the way, what is the US doing to Russia? It is devastating the Russian economy with these suffocating sanctions that don't discriminate between who supports Putin and who opposes Putin. This is collective punishment of over 100 million Russians that have resulted in a 40% depreciation of the currency, the ruble. And imagine if the US dollar depreciated by 40%. That means that people's wages would be decreased by 40%. That means that your savings in your bank account would decrease by 40%. It means your purchasing power would decrease by 40%. It means that if you're a retiree, your Social Security payment or your pension would be decreased by 40%. That's what these sanctions are doing to Russians. So the US is already punishing Russia. What can people in the US do? They can pressure the government that has the most responsibility for this conflict, for creating the war in Ukraine, which is the US government. They can call for an end to NATO. They can demand that the US government stop escalating the war in Ukraine and instead demand that Russia and Ukraine go to the negotiating table and have a peaceful political resolution to this conflict. Finally, I mentioned Russia's 3 major demands. One of them is not very realistic. I don't see the Ukrainian government realistically coming to accept that Crimea is part of Russia. Although, by the way, Crimea did have a democratic referendum in which over 90% of people in Crimea who speak Russian, who identify with Russia, over 90% supported joining the Russian Federation. Even Henry Kissinger, one of the worst US war criminals, one of the worst war criminals, period, in history, even he acknowledged that the Russian annexation of Crimea was something that the majority of people in Crimea supported. That's not to, again, that's a very different situation from the invasion of Ukraine that we're seeing now. But the point is that anyway, I don't see the government in Kiev realistically accepting that. And I certainly don't expect them to accept the independence of Donetsk and Lugansk and the Donbass. However, the demands that Russia made are rooted in demands that Ukraine technically legally agreed to in 2015. This is another historical detail to understand this conflict that is completely ignored. And it's almost never mentioned in the Western corporate media. In 2015, the Ukrainian government, even under the hardline nationalists of Petro Poroshenko, the Ukrainian government agreed to the Minsk II agreement. Now, it was called Minsk II because there was a Minsk I agreement that fell through, and with US support and US weapons and military aid, under Poroshenko, the Ukrainian government launched a brutal attack on the eastern Donbass region, killing thousands of Ukrainian citizens. That war failed. The people in the Donbass successfully fought against Ukraine. And by the way, two researchers at the RAND Corporation, which is a Pentagon cutout funded by the US government, they acknowledged in an article in Foreign Policy, which is the de facto voice of the Washington foreign policy establishment, they admitted that the vast majority of people who have been fighting in eastern Ukraine before Russia invaded, they wrote this, the vast majority were Ukrainians. They were not Russians. They were Ukrainians. This was a civil war. The Ukrainian military and National Guard and government failed, so they came back to peace talks in 2015. Those peace talks were brokered by Germany and France in what was called the Normandy format between Ukraine, Russia, Germany, and France. The Ukrainian government agreed to the Minsk II protocols. According to Minsk II, the Ukrainian government, one, agreed to recognize the autonomy of the Donetsk and Lugansk regions and decentralize power. It also agreed to ceasefires that were violated by both sides, and it agreed to demilitarize. The Ukrainian government did not do any of that. And the US government pressured the Ukrainian government to not support the Minsk II agreement. Let's not forget, Washington was not invited to the Minsk agreement talks, the Minsk protocol talks they were in Minsk, Belarus. It was Germany and France, not the United States. The US never supported the Minsk II agreement because it recognized that if it allowed autonomy for the eastern Donbass region in Ukraine, it would basically prevent Ukraine from ever joining NATO, because NATO has this stipulation that any country that has a territorial dispute cannot join NATO, because if there's a territorial dispute, immediately when that country joined NATO, then it would start a war with the country that has a territorial dispute. So if Ukraine agreed to recognize the autonomy of Donetsk and Lugansk, then Ukraine could de facto never join NATO, because if Ukraine joined NATO, it would instantly mean a war with Russia. So the US, since 2015, when the Minsk II protocols were agreed to and were voted on by a UN Security Council resolution that makes them legally binding according to international law, ever since, the US has been opposing peace in Ukraine, has been further militarizing this war. So yes, Russia bears responsibility for escalating the war, but the US bears responsibility more for starting this war in 2014 and then refusing to implement the Minsk II agreements that basically Russia is now demanding through these demands at the peace negotiations going on in both Belarus and in Turkey. And again, I want to repeat this. The US, the EU, and NATO are not calling for peace in Ukraine. They're calling for escalation in Ukraine. They're calling for an insurgency. They're calling for more war. They're calling for a no-fly zone, which would mean potentially world war with Russia and potentially nuclear war.
Thank you for that answer. So I wanted to ask a question about this article that you recently published on Multipolarista, which is by a left-wing Ukrainian peace activist who presents a very different perspective than what we've seen from most Western outlets. And he explains how the US government created the crisis and how he feels like the US is exploiting Ukraine as cannon fodder against Russia. So I wonder if you could speak to that point at all. You already made the comparison to Afghanistan, but it's been kind of suggested that the US would just abandon Ukraine and it would become another Afghanistan. Yeah,
well, I mean, it depends what we mean by another Afghanistan, because there's two wars in Afghanistan, right? In modern history, very recent history, you can go back to the British wars in Afghanistan and the Great Game and all of the European colonial powers. But there's the 1980s war in Afghanistan, in which the CIA, the ISI, Pakistani intelligence, and Saudi Arabia created the Mujahideen, funded and trained the Mujahideen with billions of dollars, which became Al-Qaeda and the Taliban. And that was a war against the Soviet military that had intervened to support a socialist government in Afghanistan. And then there is the US NATO military occupation of Afghanistan for 20 years. Let's not forget, it was a US NATO military occupation of Afghanistan. It wasn't just the United States. It was NATO played a key role in the Afghan war. So when we say the US might abandon Ukraine like Afghanistan, it's hard to, sometimes people mean different things. They might mean supposedly abandoning Afghanistan like it did last year in 2021 by finally withdrawing after a military occupation for 20 years. And now the US has stolen the Afghan central bank's reserves, frozen them, which is potentially going to unleash mass famine in Afghanistan. And there could be hundreds of thousands or millions of Afghans who die from starvation and food insecurity, which is even more than the hundreds of thousands of Afghans who died in the 20-year US NATO occupation. So there are comparisons to be made, not with the 2001 to 2021 war in Afghanistan, but rather with the 1980s war in Afghanistan, in which the US used Afghanistan to bleed the Soviet Union, or as Brzezinski said, the US National Security Advisor and imperial strategist, to bleed Russia in its soft belly, he said. Because let's not forget that the Soviet Union had a dozen republics. It wasn't just Russia. And Afghanistan was directly next to the Soviet Union. So, I mean, this was a proxy war against the Soviet Union that was supported by the US. And in that sense, the US is using Ukraine as a proxy war against Russia right on its borders. So there are very, very many parallels between those campaigns. And this is why I think it's actually fair to say that one of the critiques of Russia invading Ukraine is not only that it's bad for the people of Ukraine, that Ukrainian people are dying, that Russians are dying. You know, young Russian men don't want to die either in this war. But obviously, it's Ukrainians who are dying, and they are the majority of people being killed, and that's awful for the people of Ukraine. But another very real critique to be made of Russia from an anti-war leftist perspective is that this actually, in some ways, is very good for U.S. imperialism and NATO. Because as Condoleezza Rice, the war criminal and Iraq war architect of the George W. Bush administration, as she said in a recent interview on Fox News, she boasted that the Russian invasion of Ukraine has helped to unify NATO more than she's ever seen it unified in history. And that's true. I mean, that's an unfortunate reality, is that, you know, we can criticize Russia for helping to strengthen Western imperialism with this and strengthen these warmongering elements that now say that not only should NATO expand, but Germany should remilitarize. Let's think about this for a second. What happened last time Germany remilitarized? And they're saying that Germany should remilitarize and send weapons to Ukraine, where neo-Nazis play a significant role in the security forces. I mean, we've even seen Michael McFaul, the former U.S. ambassador to Russia and inveterate war hawk. He said in a recent interview on TV, he said that Putin is worse than Hitler, who's responsible for tens of millions of deaths, probably the worst war criminal in history. And we now see people whitewashing Adolf Hitler. There was a former member of the Berlin parliament who was part of the Pirate Party, who had this Twitter thread recently that went viral, where he was whitewashing Hitler and saying that Putin is basically crazier than Hitler. So we are literally at the point where German politicians are whitewashing Hitler, and Germany is remilitarizing, and Japan is remilitarizing. Japan, by the way, also imposed sanctions on Russia. These are the classical fascist powers are remilitarizing and sending weapons to Ukraine and whitewashing Hitler. I mean, can we think seriously about what's happening here? We need to look past this ridiculous war fervor, this hysteria. I mean, I'm in my 30s, so I wasn't super old, but I do remember 9/11. I do remember the immediate post 9/11 era. And this reminds me so much of this hysterical war fervor that we saw in the United States at the time. And let's not forget the horrible decisions that the US government took after 9/11 that are responsible for so many of the crises around the world that we are seeing today. And let's think critically and cautiously about what the US and NATO and the EU are doing now, escalating in Ukraine, because we can have very serious consequences in the years to come. Just as the US support for the Mujahideen in Afghanistan gave birth to Al-Qaeda and the Taliban, just as the war on terror helped spread these terrorist groups around West Asia and South Asia and Northern Africa, there's a very real possibility of this insurgency that the CIA is supporting in Ukraine. Very, very quickly here, this is an article that was just published by Yahoo News that, again, I mean, this is as mainstream as it gets. This is Yahoo News about how the CIA has been training these paramilitary groups in Ukraine. This is in Kiev. They were training these paramilitaries, and what percentage of them were Nazis? What percentage of them were these far-right nationalists? And here's an article that Yahoo News published even before that on January 13th, titled "CIA trained Ukrainian paramilitaries may take central role if Russia invades." I mean, I mentioned Afghanistan in the 1980s. What about Syria after 2011, where the CIA spent $1 billion a year arming and training these so-called moderate rebels, many of whom became Al-Qaeda, Jabhat al-Nusra, or even ISIS? And the current national security advisor, Jake Sullivan, who used to be a national security advisor for Hillary Clinton when she was Secretary of State in the first Obama administration, we have a leaked email from him to Hillary Clinton that was published by WikiLeaks, and Julian Assange is a political prisoner because of this. In this email from Jake Sullivan, he admitted, this is an exact quote, AQ is on our side in Syria. That is, Al-Qaeda is on our side in Syria. So the US insurgency war in Afghanistan in the 1980s gave birth to Al-Qaeda and the Taliban. The US CIA insurgency war in Syria helped give birth to ISIS, along with the US-Iraq war, helped give birth to ISIS. And we now could be seeing the very real possibility of this insurgency in Ukraine giving birth to neo-Nazi fascist terrorist groups that carry out terrorist attacks in the West.
Yeah, and also worth mentioning that a lot of those people from other countries are traveling to Ukraine to be trained militarily. But someone asked a really good question in the chat, and I think it connects to what we were talking about sanctions and about also the potential rise of more fascism across the world. So could you speak at all to the concept of multipolarity, what a reshaping of world power could look like? And then specifically, someone asked in the chat, what will happen if Russia and China develop an alternative to the US dollar?
Well, I could spend a long time talking about this, but my answers have been kind of long here, so I'll try to keep this relatively short. On multipolarity. What is multipolarity? It is having multiple poles of power in the world. What is unipolarity? Unipolarity is the system of the political and economic system that we saw from 1991 until recently. The US government dominated international politics and economics ever since the end of the first Cold War. I say first Cold War because we're now in a new Cold War, the second Cold War, against not only Russia, but also China. So we saw this clearly when the Soviet Union was overthrown, the Eastern Bloc was overthrown, and these color revolutions I talked about. And then we saw the US invasion, the first invasion of Iraq, the Gulf War in 1990, 1991, in which former CIA director turned president, George H.W. Bush Sr., he declared a so-called New World Order, which has nothing to do with lizard people and the Illuminati and those crazy conspiracies. The New World Order he was talking about meant U.S. unipolar hegemony, the U.S. empire controlling the entire world. Neoconservatives referred to it as full spectrum dominance. We also have a leaked Defense Department strategy memo from the 1990s that was leaked by the New York Times that is called the Wolfowitz Doctrine, that was drafted under the George H.W. Bush administration by these hardline neoconservative elements that later were architects of the Iraq War. They were brought back in the Bush Jr. administration, like Wolfowitz, like Cheney, like Rumsfeld. And what is the Wolfowitz doctrine? It says clearly, you can read it in the New York Times, that the Pentagon's goal is to prevent any other geostrategic competitor in the world, period. That means unipolar control of the planet. The US is the global policeman. The US can wage war anywhere it wants with no consequences. No one can stop it. As Francis Fukuyama, the neoliberal sophist, fake intellectual, as he famously declared in his book, The End of History and the Last Man, he said that this is this unipolar hegemonic order in which the US imposes neoliberal structural adjustment in the Washington Consensus around the world. It was the end of history. Well, it clearly was not the end of history. Fukuyama has since recanted that ridiculous thesis, and we see the rise not only of Russia, but of China, and challenging not only the US political architecture through NATO, but also the economic architecture. And China has become, in terms of PPP, purchasing power parity, China is by far the largest economy in the world. And according to one of the main CIA contractors, McKinsey, China also has had the largest economic growth in the past 20 years. And the Chinese economy, in terms of, again, its purchasing power, McKinsey admitted that it's larger than the US economy. And the Chinese economy is now larger than all of the members of the European Union combined. So multipolarity means that now countries in the global South no longer have to get loans from the IMF and work with the World Bank in order to implement their projects. They have other options, loans from China, the Belt and Road Initiative, this massive infrastructure project that Beijing has now signed over 100 countries to around the world. So that's an example of multipolarity. Now, there are good things and bad things about multipolarity. Multipolarity doesn't mean the end to imperialism, not only the end to US imperialism, which we still see with the war in Yemen, which I began talking about. Again, nearly 400,000 Yemenis dead, according to the United Nations, and that war is almost never mentioned. And the Biden administration has continued selling weapons to Saudi Arabia that have been used to massacre Yemenis. So clearly, the US empire is still waging these wars around the world. The US military is still illegally occupying Syria, including the oil and wheat rich regions of Syria. The US military is still occupying Iraq against the democratic vote of the elected parliament of Iraq, that is the people of Iraq. So multipolarity also means what we see, that Russia can feel that it can invade Ukraine. It's now militarily strong enough to take actions like that. That's obviously bad for the people of Ukraine. It's bad for peace. So that's multipolarity as well. But it also means that there's now space for projects of transformation. And that's what interests me about multipolarity. Not to sit here and defend Russia and all of that. What interests me about multipolarity as a leftist, as a socialist, is the possibilities that it opens for progressive movements, socialist movements, because what we saw in the era of unipolarity and what we saw during the first Cold War, which was an era of bipolarity between the US-led imperial order and then you also had the socialist bloc, is that any country, especially in the global South, that tried to have a socialist government, whether that was democratically elected, like in Chile with Salvador Allende, or if it was through a revolution, like in Cuba and Korea and Vietnam and Zimbabwe and Angola and all these other countries, they were drowned in blood through these horrible colonialist wars. We saw the CIA coup against Allende in 1973, excuse me, on the first 9/11 in 1973 in Chile. We saw the infamous CIA coup against the left-wing prime minister of Mohammad Mossadegh of Iran, who was overthrown for trying to nationalize Iran's oil. So all of those projects of progressive transformation, of socialist transformation, were overthrown by US imperialism, by US meddling in the bipolar first Cold War. And then in the unipolar era, we saw that the US felt like it could overthrow any post-colonial government that it wanted. It overthrew the Libyan government, which was the most prosperous country in Africa, which obviously Muammar Gaddafi, there's valid critiques of him, but I mean, objectively speaking, it was the most prosperous country in Africa. The people of Libya had healthcare, they had education, they were guaranteed housing. They were, even if you got married, you were guaranteed money toward buying a house for your family. You were guaranteed money toward buying a car. They had a very strong safety net. And Libya also was a strong supporter of national liberation struggles around the world, including in Palestine and including in Nicaragua and including even in Ireland. Libya supported the Irish Republican struggle against British colonialism. And what happened? Libya went from being the most prosperous country in Africa to being a failed state. After the NATO 2011 war, they had open-air slave markets, ethnic cleansing of dark-skinned Africans, sub-Saharan Africans in Libya. And still today, 11 years later, there is no central government in Libya. That is an example of US unipolarity. The war in Syria. So the war by NATO that destroyed Yugoslavia, which was the last socialist country in Europe. It was destroyed. Not only was the socialist government overthrown, it ceased to exist as a country. And Bosnia and Herzegovina, still today, it has a chancellor who is an unelected European bureaucrat who is not appointed by the people of Bosnia and Herzegovina. He is a European colonial overlord who was imposed on the people of Bosnia ever since the destruction of Yugoslavia, still today. So that's multipolarity, means that there are now multiple poles, which means countries like Venezuela, and here where I am in Nicaragua, and Cuba have been able to survive getting around illegal US sanctions because they can do business with China. They can do business with Russia. They can do business with Iran. One of the main reasons that Venezuela has been able to survive the brutal, devastating US blockade illegally imposed on Venezuela is that it's been able to export its oil to China. It's been able to import the lighter crude and the diluents that it needs from Iran, and then Iran in turn imports the heavy crude from Venezuela. That's multipolarity. And then finally, I mentioned the Belt and Road Initiative. Well, another element of multipolarity is de-dollarization. And I would invite people to listen to lectures by the brilliant economist Michael Hudson, or you can read his incredible book, Super Imperialism, in which he talks about how the US dollar is a geopolitical weapon of Washington, not only used in terms of the petrodollar. Saudi Arabia agreed ever since the end of World War II. FDR, on his last Valentine's Day, February 14th, 1945, before he passed away, he met with King Ibn Saud of Saudi Arabia on a US aircraft carrier, and in the Gulf, and he said that the US would provide security for the Saudi monarchy. In return, Saudi Arabia would sell oil with the dollar and ensure the stability of the global oil market. We now see that the US has been trying to pressure Saudi Arabia to make up for the decline in Russian oil exports to Europe and the US itself. So that alliance still very much continues, although we've actually seen Saudi Arabia has potentially discussed selling oil to China, specifically in the yuan. So these countries around the world have been trapped by the dollar. If you want to do an infrastructure project, if you want to fund education and healthcare, well, you might have to take a loan from the IMF. And the IMF imposes these brutal neoliberal structural adjustment programs. You have to cut healthcare. You have to cut education. You have to cut the minimum wage. You have to privatize state-owned industries. The Washington Consensus was implemented through these IMF loans. You can read the brilliant book by John Perkins, Confessions of an Economic Hitman, who he was involved in these programs and talked about how they worked. Well, China does not impose the same political conditions on its loans. China, in fact, the Financial Times, which is the voice of the British capitalists, a mainstream media outlet, they have acknowledged that China has in fact done mass forgiveness and renegotiation of debts in the global South, in Africa, in Latin America. It is much more favorable agreements, bilateral agreements with the global south. And even the former finance minister of Greece, Yanis Varoufakis of the left-wing Syriza party, which was crushed under the European Union and the European Central Bank by austerity, the European Central Bank knew Greece could never pay off. Even Yanis Varoufakis has admitted that in the meetings that they held with Chinese creditors, they were much more favorable to Greece's political needs and economic needs than the Europeans themselves. And Greece is part of the European Union. So that's multipolarity as well. What does de-dollarization mean? It means that countries can try other forms of development that are not just along the lines of the neoliberal structural adjustment programs I talked about, of the Washington Consensus, because those programs were enforced through dollar-denominated debt. If you are Honduras and you want to build a highway, if you want to build a new airport and you need capital, where do you go? Who's going to give you that capital to do those projects? Well, the IMF is one of the only places to go, was one of the only places to go until recently, now with China and the Belt and Road and the Chinese Developmental Bank and all these projects. So what happens is the Honduran government requests an IMF loan, which is denominated not in the lempira, the Honduran currency, it's denominated in dollars, which means that the Honduran government needs X number of dollars to pay off that debt with interest, which is a way of the US government, it's the only government that has veto power over the IMF and the World Bank. The US can use those loans to force political and economic concessions from countries that take that dollar-denominated debt and then forcibly impose privatizations and neoliberal programs that are advantageous to the interests of US corporations on those countries in order for them to pay off those debts and renegotiate those debts. So one of the good sides, I mentioned some of the bad sides, also Turkey is an example of one of the bad sides of multipolarity. It is a member of NATO, which is trying to play Russia and NATO against each other. So Turkey buys Russian military equipment while also waging war against Syria and waging war against the people of Armenia by supporting Azerbaijan in the wars recently we saw in Nagorno-Karabakh or Artsakh. So that's a bad example of multipolarity. A good example of multipolarity is it opens space for these socialist movements and progressive movements in the global south to work with China and Russia and Iran and Brazil and South Africa and other countries, the BRIC system, instead of just having to rely on the neoliberal World Bank and IMF that these countries have been crushed under for decades.
I want to draw attention to a question in the chat that was put in earlier. Someone asked, what is happening to civilians in the Donbas region, which we already kind of touched on? And also, what about the Azov battalion in Mariupol region, preventing civilians from leaving using civilian quarters to leave by shooting at them?
Yeah, great question. So this is a war. And obviously, unfortunately, the Russian military has been killing civilians, not intentionally. I mean, it's tragic and it's criminal. I mean, obviously, anytime a civilian is killed, it's bad. It's actually, let me take that back. The use of criminal, we need to be specific about that. It's criminal if it's intentionally killing civilians. Now, the Russian invasion of Ukraine is criminal. It is against international law. But what I wanted to say here is that Russia is not intentionally killing civilians. Now, it's bad that Russia invaded, but that doesn't mean that they're intentionally killing civilians. And we can see this with their policy here of creating civilian corridors to evacuate. And this isn't even just my opinion. You can even listen to the former colonel and major military officer, Douglas McGregor, who, of all places, on Fox News, he was invited and he said things basically saying that Russia is not intentionally trying to kill civilians. In fact, they've been trying to minimize civilian casualties because they're trying to impose political concessions from Ukraine. That is their demand. I mentioned the three demands they have, which is demilitarization of Ukraine, which means never joining NATO, which means also the neutralization of Ukraine, so it's not a Western outpost, and recognizing the independence of Donetsk and Lugansk and the Donbass, and the and Crimea being part of Russia. Those are Russia's demands, and it's using the invasion to try to force Ukraine to agree to those demands. And they have other demands as well, but those are even less realistic. So now, Douglas McGregor pointed out that when Russia went in, one of the reasons that this war has dragged on is that it actually went in very lightly. Again, this is not to excuse the Russian invasion. I'm not saying that it's a good thing. I'm not saying I support it, but we also need to be able to have a very serious analysis of the facts, a sober analysis. And Douglas McGregor, this US military officer who actually served in the Trump administration, he has been acknowledging these basic facts. Also, another very good military analyst who's a former US military intelligence officer Scott Ritter, has been doing very good analysis of this. Scott Ritter has made the same points, that Russia did not go in with the heavy hand. That's why they haven't taken Kiev. That's why they've been focusing on the eastern parts, eastern regions, especially Mariupol in the southeast near the Azov Sea. And they're trying to retake Mariupol, which had originally been taken by the Russian-speaking separatists back in 2014, before Azov helped play a key role in taking it back by the Ukrainian government. And they want that to become likely part of the Donetsk People's Republic. So that explains the strategy that Russia's been taking here. And obviously, it's really horrible when anytime civilians are killed. But what I'm saying is that Russia is not intentionally killing civilians, and the Ukrainian military is not intentionally killing civilians either. However, we have seen these reports that these neo-Nazis, including Azov, which have a significant presence in Mariupol, in fact, they have their origins in Mariupol, that they have been preventing civilians from being escorted out, from being evacuated out of Mariupol, which is essentially using civilians as human shields. This is not just my view. This is the view that Douglas McGregor has made. Again, a major former US military officer. And he has said, look, the Russian government is trying to evacuate the civilians so then it can just bomb the city and take the city. Obviously, I'm not defending that. This is not something that is, this is a war. Like, I'm not defending that, but that doesn't mean that Russia's intentionally trying to kill civilians. That's why they created these humanitarian corridors. This is exactly what they did in Syria when they were trying to retake Aleppo from these Western-backed Salafi jihadist extremist rebels. They created humanitarian evacuation corridors, and many of these extremists in Syria refused to allow the civilians to leave because they knew that when the civilians left, they were going to be brutally shelled by artillery. So that explains the Russian strategy. Again, this is not to defend the Russian invasion, but let's not be infantile, naive sycophants saying that Russia bad, West good, Putin, Hitler, Zelensky, Superman. No, let's be serious here. Let's have an actual nuanced understanding of what both sides are doing in this war.
So we are nearing the end of our webinar, and we have a couple more questions. But first, I want to let people know that we are having a book club reading Stephen Cohen's book, War with Russia, which is a great geopolitical history of Russia, Ukraine, the US, concentrated on 2014. So Amar will put his email in the chat if you're interested. That's on Wednesday, March 30th at 3 p.m. But yeah, so for our next question, we've had a little bit of debate in the chat based on that last question, saying whether we're defending indiscriminate attacks. And we wanted to ask about sort of the difference in military strategy between Russia and sort of what we might be used to as Americans, as people living under the US military industrial complex. So there's been this kind of dominant narrative that Russia is encountering this unexpected resistance from Ukraine, and it's a reflection of Putin's poor planning or miscalculation. But some people have also countered that, saying that the US way of waging war might produce more immediate results because it just immediately uses, devastating violence, bombing out entire countries, and that Russia's strategy isn't quite that. So could you speak at all to maybe the difference in military strategy and what people have been saying in the chat?
Yeah, superficially I can. I'll just say that I have no military background. I would never in any way claim to have military expertise, but I will echo what I've learned from listening to actual military experts. Specifically, I mentioned two people, Scott Ritter. Scott Ritter is a former US military intelligence officer, and he was a weapons inspector in Iraq who famously went against the Bush administration saying, look, I'm a UN weapons inspector. I haven't been to Iraq and I found no evidence of weapons of mass destruction. Scott Ritter has been doing good articles and interviews explaining the Russian military strategy in Ukraine. I also mentioned Douglas Macgregor. Douglas Macgregor is on the conservative side. I don't agree with him politically in some things, but he is a serious military analyst and expert. And both of them have had very similar analysis, basically saying, look, this is not a defense of the Russian invasion, but Russia is not indiscriminately targeting civilians. It did not do the kind of shock and awe that the US did in Iraq, the so-called Powell Doctrine. It did not do that. Russia has been focusing on targeting military installations and Ukrainian forces to impose political demands on Ukraine, surrounding Ukrainian military forces in what it calls cauldrons in order to force them to surrender, and then again, forcing its political demands on them. Now, that is not what the US does. The US goes in, bombs the hell out of a country, destroys the government, de-Baathifies, creates a whole new government in its image, and then that government falls apart, as we saw in Iraq and Afghanistan. In the case of Afghanistan, in record time, in a matter of days. So again, this is not to defend the Russian invasion, but we should understand that Russia and the US are not the same. They have very different strategies. They have very different politics. And if you listen to those military experts, Scott Ritter and Douglas Macgregor, they have said that the Russian military strategy is to go in with a lighter footprint targeting military targets in order to impose its political demands. And now we see that the war has continued because they went in initially not doing shock and awe and doing these lower level attacks targeting military areas, and it didn't work. So now they're in this situation where Scott Ritter has argued that they're in a position where they're going to win pretty soon and force Kiev to meet their demands, whether or not it agrees in negotiations or not. And Douglas Macgregor slightly disagrees. But the point is that this narrative that Russia is losing the war and it's taking longer than it thought. I mean, how do these people know what Putin's plans are? I mean, they keep saying that like Putin is this secretive dictator who never leaves the Kremlin and he's going crazy. Well, if he doesn't share his plans, how do they secretly know what his plans are? Does he share them with the CIA? I mean, no. Again, let's be serious here. Let's be real. Let's be adults. Like, if you want to understand what's happening, we should listen to real military experts. And I would recommend Scott Ritter.
Cool. Thanks for those recommendations. We can definitely send those out in an email after too. So we wanted to ask about the no-fly zone again, since this is something that we are sharing as an organization, asking people to take action around. And recently there was a Reuters poll that showed 74% of Americans support a no-fly zone over Ukraine, yet the majority also oppose sending American troops to Ukraine or conducting airstrikes, which shows they have no idea what a no-fly zone actually means. So I wanted to ask both, why has the idea of a no-fly zone been so contentious? And also, why do Americans understand so little about the implications of what our directly entering the conflict would do?
Yeah, sorry, just 1 second. Hopefully someone can talk for like 2 minutes. I just have to go open my door because someone's at my door, but I can keep talking up until like for 15 more minutes. So I'll be right back. I swear I'm going to answer that. I'm sorry about that.
Oh, don't worry about it.
Someone's at my door. 1 second.
Yeah, so I guess now is a good time for me to share that link again to take action. And while we're waiting for Ben to get back, everyone can click that link and email their representatives about preventing the US from starting World War III. And also just another reminder that there is the book club with this amazing book called War with Russia by Stephen Cohen. That is on Wednesday, March 30th. So you have plenty of time to get a copy and check out the book. And Amar put his email in the chat. It's amar@masspeaceaction.org. If you send him an email, he can get you the information to get signed up for that book club. And I will also just drop the link to the book in the chat if anyone wants to check it out right now. Amar just put his email in the chat, so feel free to reach out. And also, while we are waiting, I'm just going to put the link to Ben's blog once more, because there's some really great content on there, and it's worth subscribing to the newsletter or checking out the social media for this news outlet. And if you're interested in joining the MAPPA No Cold War group, you can also reach out to Amar at that same email. We do a lot of fun work around Russia and China and demilitarization, ending US hostility towards those regions. And a lot of our work is also doing political education and organizing webinars like these. So definitely join the group too.
Hey, I'm sorry about that. Okay. All right. So the no-fly zone question, that Reuters report that it said that 3/4 of people in the US support a no-fly zone, it had an incredible line in there, buried in the middle, where it said that it wasn't clear if people who said they supported a no-fly zone understood what the consequences would be. Those consequences are shooting down Russian planes, which means the potential of World War III. And we've seen Zelensky has been giving these talks to the US Congress, to the German Bundestag, and he has been saying that we want a no-fly zone. He's basically calling for World War III. I mean, I was listening to this Senate Intelligence Committee hearing that I mentioned at the beginning, in which CIA Director William Burns admitted that the US is waging an information war on Russia. In that same hearing, we saw these neoconservative congressmen, senators like Marco Rubio and Tom Cotton and Ben Sasse or Sass or whatever his name is, they were grilling the CIA and military leaders for not sending more weapons and not imposing a no-fly zone in Ukraine. And the military leaders from in this hearing, from the DIA and NSA, who were both generals, they both said that this would be a major escalation and would lead to war with Russia. This is the same warning that we saw back in 2016. The last time there was a big discussion in the US, a debate around a no-fly zone, people might remember, was in 2016 during the presidential debates between Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump. And Hillary Clinton was calling for a no-fly zone in Syria. And the no-fly zone would have resulted in shooting down Russian planes, which would have meant war, hot war with Russia over Syria. And when Hillary Clinton was calling for that policy, there was another congressional testimony in which a general, this was a video that went viral at the time in 2016, a general said that a no-fly zone would result in a hot war with Russia. So it's not a surprise. This isn't new. We've known this for years now, but it's an example of what I said earlier, that Russia is not the only culprit here. I'm not saying that Russia's innocent. I'm not saying that we should support the invasion, but I'm saying that if we are serious about our peace activism, if we are serious about being against war, we have to recognize that the US is not only responsible for starting this war in the first place and continuing to fuel it for years, but it's also responsible for escalating it right now. And it's not enough to just say that Russia should end and withdraw its troops. We also need to say that the US and these Western powers need to stop sending weapons to Ukraine, need to stop escalating the situation, need to stop allowing people from around the world go to Ukraine to fight to the last Ukrainian to get back at Russia, and need to instead push for serious peace talks. Let's not forget, there was so much discussion about the war in Syria that the only solution is a political solution. We constantly heard Western politicians say, the only solution to the war in Syria is a political solution. Meanwhile, they were flooding Syria with billions of dollars of weapons, arming and training an insurgency, including many extremist Salafi jihadist rebels. So if you actually believe that the only solution is a political solution and peace and negotiations, you can't simultaneously fuel the war with more weapons, with more insurgents, with training through the CIA. That's what the US is doing. So yes, we should call for peace in Ukraine, to an end to this war, but an actual end, because again, it didn't start on February 24th. It started really back in 2014. And the solution to this conflict in Ukraine is not a no-fly zone. The solution is demilitarization and with of course, yes, withdrawal of the Russian troops, but also withdrawal of all NATO forces. And we potentially saw that NATO forces were recently hit in a Ukrainian military installation in Western Ukraine by this Russian missile attack just on the border near the border of Poland this past week. So we need to recognize that just saying that one side, Russia, needs to end the military escalation is not actually an anti-war position. It can, in some ways, it can be a pro-war position because they're advocating the Western side of the war. If we're serious about being anti-war activists, we have to oppose the war being waged by the US and by NATO. And by the way, that war is not only a conventional military war through sending weapons and training and troops and all of that, it's also an economic war, and it's also an information war.
So we're just up on time. So I think a good way to end off would be if you could give any advice to people watching who maybe something you said resonated with them. Maybe, they are starting to believe that, but just starting to see the, the cracks in the U.S. military industrial complex and in the dominant Western media narrative. What would your advice be to those of us who might be, looking to start to counter those narratives? What resources would you recommend? How can we tell when something that we're reading is being distorted by these imperialist narratives?
Very good question. First of all, I'll echo a criticism I said earlier, which is a valid criticism of Russia. I mean, Russia should be criticized for making it even more difficult to be an anti-war activist in the West, which was already very hard. The peace movement was repressed and censored and silenced. And now, I mean, this invasion has actually strengthened NATO more than I've ever seen in my lifetime. And many people older than me have said in their lifetime. So in that sense, it's difficult, and I think we should expect difficult days ahead. But at the same time, we need to know these facts. We need to study. We need to talk with people. We need to educate, and we need to organize clear, consistent messaging. And one of those messages needs to be very clearly no to NATO, abolish NATO. NATO is responsible for this war. NATO is not the solution. The solution to war is not more war. NATO is a warmongering alliance. It always has been. And if people want to reach out to me, I mean, you can contact me through multipolarista.com or email at multipolarista.com, and I can send reading suggestions on many of these topics. I mean, in terms of NATO, I think Daniele Glasser he's an Italian writer who has written about Operation Gladio. Knowing the real history of NATO is important. I mentioned earlier, NATO was founded, one of its founding members was the fascist dictatorship of Portugal. Through Operation Gladio and Operation Paperclip, NATO supported and the US supported many former Nazis and Nazi collaborators and fascists. NATO in 2017 created a propaganda film honoring the Forrest brothers, who were Baltic Nazi collaborators, many of whom were part of the Waffen-SS, and that means that they had a personal loyalty oath to Adolf Hitler. And then after World War II, the CIA and NATO turned them into anti-Soviet guerrillas, these Nazi collaborators. So we need to be clear about that history of NATO. We need to make it clear that NATO, the most important demand of the peace movement, needs to be abolishing NATO. And of course, that's in the short, medium, and long term. And the short term, another demand should be end to the escalation in war in Ukraine. So that means that not only does Russia bear responsibility, but no more weapons fueling this war, no more Western military support for Ukraine. Instead, what we all should be demanding is that Ukraine and Russia need to sit down and have serious peace talks, and they need to both come to a binding agreement and need to be held to that agreement. And then other things we should talk about: decreasing the US military budget. Every single year, it has increased. It's now almost $800 billion on paper. In reality, it's well over $1 trillion. And now we see Germany expanding its military budget and other Western countries. That's not the solution. The solution to war is not more war. The solution to war is diplomacy. The solution to war are peace efforts. The solution to war is also challenging Western corporate media propaganda, which manufactures consent for war, which makes people think that the solution to war is a no-fly zone, which means more war. So, I mean, some of those things were kind of vague, but if I had to say very specific things people can do, organize not only to call for no-fly zone, excuse me, call for, that's actually a bad way of saying it, oppose a no-fly zone. Not only that, but end to Western military shipments to Ukraine and demand peace negotiations, demand that every single elected representative in the United States calls for Ukraine and Russia to have a ceasefire and to sit down at a table and have negotiations. Demand an end to NATO expansion. In the short term, that's easy. No more NATO expansion. Like, we can do that now. Promise no NATO expansion. In the medium term, or preferably the short term, but in the medium term, abolish NATO. NATO should not exist. NATO never should have existed, but it certainly should not exist now. And then finally, organize to oppose expanded military budgets. The US still has 800 military bases around the world. The US has military forces in over half of the world's countries. This is ridiculous. And the Russian invasion does not in any way justify any of that the US does. So it's going to be harder now, but continuing doing the work that you all have done, because it couldn't be more urgent, especially with the threat of nuclear war being a real possibility. We need people to stress that to people. Russia has its nuclear weapons in high alert for the first time since the 1960s. We're talking about the potential of a nuclear war breaking out. This could not be more important.
Well, thank you so much again, Ben, for this wonderful webinar. I hope, resonated with everyone here. I hope you changed some people's perspectives, maybe, who haven't been enlightened to what isn't being covered, in the Western media. And I think ending with, a loud and resounding abolish NATO is a great way to finish off the night. So please, everyone, check out the links in the chat, check out Multipolarista, and take action to tell Congress, oppose a no-fly zone, and definitely join the No Cold War group if you liked what you heard tonight. Ben, do you have any last words you want to share with people?
No, I'll echo what you said. Everyone should join the No Cold War group. It's so important because we need to understand that this conflict in Ukraine is part and parcel of the new Cold War. The 2014 coup in Ukraine was about preventing Ukraine from having a pro-Russian government, and Russia and China have become key allies. And all of this aggressive posturing by the US and NATO and the EU is about containing Russia and also containing China. So this is unfortunately just one episode in a larger war, and that's the new Cold War, the second Cold War, which I mentioned the threat of nuclear conflict and other potential threats. This is all something that we can organize against by opposing the new Cold War.
Well, thank you so much again. And thank you everyone who stayed for the full 2 hours. We hope you have a good rest of your night.